The Arizona territory was a land of extremes, where the sun either burned or baked, and the dust never seemed to settle. In the spring of 1817, this particular corner of the desert seemed to be caught in an eternal state of drought and despair. Melissa Hartley stood on the worn wooden porch of the shack that had been her home for as long as she could remember. The shack was barely standing, the roof sagging under the weight of age and neglect. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the vast emptiness that stretched beyond the horizon, endless, just like her future seemed. She had no idea that today would be the day her life changed. In fact, she had long ago stopped expecting anything to change. The days bled into each other, and the only thing she had learned to rely on was the steady rhythm of survival. Her father, James Hartley, was a man who had been broken long before she came into the world. His life had been full of poor choices and failures, his reputation nothing but a collection of debts owed to everyone around him. But today, as the wind kicked up dust and rattled the cracked window panes of the shack, Melissa knew something was different. Something was coming. Vincent Vaughn, a wealthy rancher from a nearby town, had come to settle that debt, but he wasn't here for gold or cattle, or any of the usual currency that the people of the West traded in. No, Vincent had come to collect something much more valuable than any of that, something that could never be repaid. James Hartley's actions, his neglect of his daughter, had cost him far more than he realized. Vincent dismounted from his horse, boots heavy on the dry ground as he moved towards the shack. There was no need for the sound of spurs to announce his arrival. Everyone in this part of the world already knew why he was here. His presence alone carried weight, and Melissa could feel it like a storm on the horizon. Her father was no stranger to hardship, but the way he looked at Vincent suggested this time was different. This time, the consequences might be severe. "What do you want?" James spat, his voice full of defiance but also something deeper, a fear that was hard to ignore. "I've come for what you owe," Vincent said, his voice calm but filled with the kind of resolve that made James shrink back. James didn't answer right away, his eyes flickering to the ground as if searching for a way out. "I don't have it," he finally said, a slur to his words as if the alcohol clouded his judgment. "The land's dead." The mines dried up. "You knew that when you lent me the money." Vincent stood still, not moved by the excuse. He wasn't here for sympathy. He wasn't here for the excuses. The debt was due, and he intended to collect one way or another. But then something shifted. Melissa's father stepped aside and gestured toward her. The tension in the air grew thicker as James said, "Take her. Call it even." His voice dripped with resignation, but in that moment Vincent's heart tightened. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. The girl standing in front of him wasn't just a debt to be settled. She was a life, a person with a story far more complicated than any financial transaction. She was his daughter, yet she was being offered as something less than that. Melissa stood tall, though the bitterness and humiliation were clear in her eyes. She was no stranger to being sold, no stranger to the idea that she was little more than a burden. But she wasn't just a daughter. She wasn't just a piece of property. She was a woman, and she would never be bargained for again. Vincent took a slow breath, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle this. He wasn't a man of many words, but the decision he would make today would change everything. His gaze met hers. For the first time, he saw her, not as a debt to be settled, but as a human being. And that, more than anything else, would set the stage for what came next. The offer no one expected. Vincent's eyes never left Melissa's. It was almost as if time stopped in that moment. James Hartley, oblivious to the subtle shift in the air, grinned as though he had just made the smartest deal of his life. But in Vincent's world, people weren't commodities to be traded away. They were people, broken, strong, or somewhere in between, but they deserved respect. And this offer? It felt like an insult, not just to Vincent, but to everything he had worked for. James was still talking, rattling off reasons why this was a fair trade. She's 18, good for nothing else. You got land, you got money, but no woman to warm your bed. Take her. It's worth more than I can offer. Vincent's jaw tightened. He didn't need this, didn't need to hear more of the man's cruel words, but he couldn't turn away, not now, not when the woman standing before him seemed to carry all the burdens of her father's wrongdoings on her shoulders. She wasn't just a daughter to be traded for a debt. She was a human being who had already suffered so much. Is that what you think of me? Melissa's voice was quiet, but it carried an unspoken weight. It wasn't just the sting of her father's words that hurt her. It was the complete lack of value he placed on her as a person. She turned away from her father, her pride rising in the face of his humiliation. "I'm not for sale," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. Vincent watched her, his gaze softening. Her strength, her defiance. He could see it in every line of her face. She wasn't just the product of her father's failures. She was a woman with her own spirit, and that spirit couldn't be bought or sold. James took a step forward, ready to retort with another insult. But Vincent didn't wait for him to speak. With one smooth motion, he stepped in front of Melissa and offered his hand, not as a deal maker, but as someone who understood what it was like to be trapped. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. Not as a debt to be settled, but as someone who can choose her own path. In that moment, the world outside the shack felt distant, as though it no longer mattered. Melissa's world, her future, lay in her hands. She wasn't sure what she expected from Vincent. She wasn't sure what would come next, but in his eyes she saw something new. The possibility of a life where she wasn't just a burden, where she wasn't someone's possession. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and took his hand. The first step toward redemption. The road away from the shack was long, and every step felt like a weight lifting from Melissa's shoulders. It wasn't that she was running from her past. It was that she was finally choosing to walk away from it. The shack, the town, and the life that had defined her for so long were now behind her. Ahead of her was uncertainty. Ahead of her was Vincent Vaughn's ranch, a place where she would find a new life. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Vincent rode alongside her, silent as the wind blew across the dusty land. There was no need for words. They both understood the gravity of what was happening. For Vincent, it was more than just settling a debt. It was about doing what was right. For Melissa, it was about reclaiming her own sense of worth. For the first time in her life, someone had offered her something more than survival. He had offered her freedom. As they arrived at the ranch, the reality of what lay before her became clear. The place wasn't a grand estate, it wasn't a palace, but it was real. The ranch was a place where people worked hard, where every day was a struggle to make ends meet. It wasn't about wealth, it was about survival, about doing what needed to be done. For Melissa, this wasn't a place of luxury, but it was a place where she could breathe. When they reached the small room by the stables, Vincent didn't offer her promises of comfort. He didn't say she would be treated like royalty. No, instead, he gave her something more, the space to choose her own future. "This is your room," Vincent said, his voice softer now. "It's not much, but it's yours." Melissa nodded, clutching her belongings tightly. She stepped inside. The coldness of the room a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun outside. But it wasn't the physical coldness that unsettled her. It was the emotional chill of a new beginning. A beginning she wasn't sure she was ready for. A ranch and a new life. The days that followed were nothing like the life Melissa had known. The ranch, sprawling and full of life, was a stark contrast to the suffocating existence she had left behind. The vast fields, the barns filled with hay, and the hum of daily chores. They all felt like part of a world she wasn't yet ready to embrace. But as she stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she unpacked her meager belongings, she realized that this place was her chance to start anew. Vincent had given her a room beside the stables, and while it was nothing luxurious, it was a space where she could breathe. There was no stench of whiskey in the air, no oppressive atmosphere of failure. It was quiet, too quiet at times, with only the distant sound of horses and the occasional call of a ranch hand breaking the silence. But Melissa welcomed the peace. She welcomed the space to think, to reflect, and most of all, to heal. As she unpacked, she caught a glimpse of Vincent's young daughter, Ella, peeking around the stable door. The little girl's wide eyes met hers, full of curiosity, and for a moment, Melissa wondered what she must look like to this child. She wasn't sure what to expect from Ella, who had been so silent since her arrival. The girl had observed her from a distance, not speaking, not offering any gestures of friendship. But now there was something different in her gaze, something soft, almost hesitant. Melissa smiled softly, offering a small wave. Ella, as if uncertain of whether it was allowed, didn't respond right away. But she didn't disappear either. She stood there for a moment, and then, as if deciding that it was okay, she nodded, her big eyes still watching Melissa closely. It wasn't much, but it was a step, a small, quiet bridge between them, the whispers of the ranch. As the days went on, the ranch became more familiar, yet Melissa could still feel the weight of the ranch hands' stares. The men who worked alongside Vincent were no strangers to hard work, but they had little tolerance for outsiders, especially women. Melissa wasn't one of them. She was the woman who had come from nowhere, who had been traded like a coin to settle a debt, and they made sure she knew it. She could hear them. Low voices, cruel laughter. They spoke about her when they thought she wasn't listening. "She's got some hips on her, huh?" one of them would say, his tone lewd and mocking. "Guess that's what Vincent's paying for, huh?" The laughter that followed was thick with the kind of derision that only men like them could produce. But Melissa didn't flinch. She didn't turn her head. She simply kept walking, her back straight, her eyes focused on the task ahead. The more they mocked her, the more it fueled her resolve. She wasn't going to bend to their cruelty. She wasn't going to let them break her. But one man, Boyd, decided to press his luck. It was a scorching midday, the sun unforgiving as Melissa made her way to the well with an empty pail. The heat weighed down on her, the dirt sticking to her skin. As she reached for the rope, Boyd stepped into her path. His eyes scanned her body, a wicked smile spreading across his face. "You don't talk much, do you?" he sneered, blocking her way. Melissa said nothing. She tried to step around him, but Boyd shifted, blocking her again. His hand brushed the inside of her wrist, and she pulled back quickly, her heart racing. She tried to step away, but Boyd followed, his breath sour against her face. "Makes a man wonder what else you're quiet about," he taunted, his hand reaching for her arm. Before Melissa could react, the sound of heavy boots approaching cut through the air. Vincent stepped into the space between them, his jaw clenched. "Get your boot off her skirt," he growled. Boyd froze. The air between them thickened, but Vincent's presence was like steel, hard and unyielding. Boyd opened his mouth to argue, but Vincent didn't wait. He stepped forward and punched Boyd square in the face, sending him stumbling backward into the dirt. The ranch hands who had gathered nearby were silent, too shocked to speak. Vincent's gaze didn't waver as he turned to the men, his voice cold and sharp. "Anyone else want to test where I draw the line?" The ranch hands stood frozen, all eyes on Vincent, and no one dared to move. Melissa, still standing in shock, looked at Vincent, her heart pounding in her chest. He had protected her, not because he owed her anything, but because he saw her. He saw her strength. and that was something that no one had done before, a tenderness in the darkness. The fire in the barn wasn't just a danger to the ranch. It was a metaphor for the fire that had been smoldering in Vincent and Melissa's hearts, a fire that neither had acknowledged but both could feel. That night, when the flames threatened to consume everything, it was Melissa's bravery that saved Ella. She ran into the burning barn, her own life at risk, to pull the small girl from the flames. In that moment, everything changed. Melissa's own body burned as she pulled Ella from the smoke and fire, but it didn't matter. Ella was safe, and that's all that mattered. She fell to the dirt outside, still holding Ella, her body seared with the heat of the fire, her skin raw. Vincent came rushing to their side, his horse kicking up dust as he arrived at the scene. He didn't speak immediately. His hands shook as he looked at the two women, one burned and exhausted, the other in her arms, safe. Without a word, he knelt beside them, carefully checking to make sure both were okay. "Why didn't you wait for help?" Vincent asked, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling slightly as he checked her burns. "I couldn't leave her," Melissa answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's just a child." Vincent looked at her, something in his gaze shifting. She wasn't just someone who had saved his daughter. She had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a reason to care again. In that moment, Melissa wasn't just a woman who had been sold to pay a debt. She was someone who had become integral to his life, to his family. Vincent gently touched her burned arm, his fingers brushing the raw skin. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured, but his actions spoke louder than any words. He was here now. He was going to take care of her. The fire that changed everything. Melissa's bravery had done more than save Ella. It had ignited something in Vincent. He had seen pain, loss, and fear in his life, but he had never allowed himself to feel those things for someone else. He had closed his heart off long ago. But the way Melissa had stepped into that fire to save his daughter, it had awakened something in him. The next few days were filled with silence. The fire had taken the barn, but it hadn't taken Vincent's resolve. He found himself thinking about Melissa more than he ever had before. The way she cared for Ella, the way she had sacrificed herself for the child, it was something Vincent couldn't ignore. One evening, after he had tended to the remaining damage from the fire, Vincent sat beside Melissa as she bandaged her wounds. Her skin was raw, but her spirit was unbroken. "You're strong," Vincent said quietly, "stronger than anyone I've ever met." Melissa met his gaze, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race, a tenderness, a vulnerability that he hadn't shown before. "Why don't you touch me?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. "Why haven't you?" Vincent's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Because if I do," he said, his voice low, "I won't be able to stop." The words hung between them, full of meaning. Vincent wasn't just speaking about physical touch. He was talking about something deeper, about the emotions, the fears, the connection they had built without realizing it. And for the first time, they both understood that what they had was real. The moment of truth. The ranch had returned to its steady rhythm after the fire, but for Vincent and Melissa, things were different now. The unspoken bond that had begun with their shared moments of silence, then deepened by the fire and the protection Vincent had given her, was now undeniable. The relationship had shifted from mere survival to something that held more meaning. Still, Melissa was cautious. She had been burned before, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Vincent's kindness had been like a gentle hand guiding her out of the darkness. But how long could it last? Despite the peace that seemed to have settled on the ranch, the echoes of Melissa's past still loomed large. It was only a matter of time before those shadows came calling again. And they did. One crisp afternoon, just as the wind began to chill the air, Vincent stood at the door of the ranch house, staring into the distance as he saw two figures approaching on horseback. His heart sank as he recognized them. James Hartley, Melissa's father, and another man he didn't recognize, a tall, well-dressed stranger with a sharp look in his eyes. Vincent's instincts were never wrong. This was trouble, and it was here. James Hartley dismounted first, his face flushed with irritation, and a toothpick hanging carelessly from his mouth. "You've got something of mine," he said, his voice oozing with a mix of arrogance and a quiet, dangerous threat. Vincent didn't flinch. His gaze stayed steady, his jaw tight. "You lost your debt. There's nothing more to talk about." But Hartley wasn't here for money anymore. He wasn't here to settle anything. Instead, he motioned toward the man standing beside him, a man dressed in fine clothes with an air of wealth about him. The man tipped his hat politely and stepped forward, his eyes scanning the ranch before resting on Melissa, who had stepped out to see who was at the door. "I'm Bernard Whitlock," the man said smoothly, his voice polite but calculated. "I hear you've come into some land, a little debt-free, and I've got an offer for you." Melissa stiffened, her heart racing as she took in the stranger's appearance. She knew exactly what was coming. She had been through it all before, offered like a prize to be won, a commodity to be bargained for. Whitlock didn't even acknowledge her as a person. He saw her only as a solution to his problem. "I've heard you're of age now, Miss Hartley, and I run a clean household. Plenty of servants, a good life. I'll pay the debt in full. No questions asked. You'll have all the comforts you could ever need. You'll want for nothing." The words hit Melissa like a slap, but it wasn't the offer that hurt. It was the implication. She wasn't even a person to these men. She was just an exchange, a way to solve problems. She turned to Vincent, her eyes searching for reassurance. But when their gazes met, it wasn't just Vincent's protection she felt. She also felt the weight of her own choices, her own desires. Could she go back to being traded like livestock? Could she return to that life of silence and acceptance? "I'm not going," she said firmly, her voice carrying over the tension in the air. Vincent's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "She doesn't belong to you," Vincent said to Hartley, his voice steady, unwavering. "Not now." "Not ever," James Hartley sneered, his lips curling into a cruel grin. But it wasn't just his anger that was visible now. It was fear. Fear that his daughter had found something better than him. Whitlock's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You may want to reconsider, Miss Hartley," he said smoothly. "A man like me doesn't offer twice." Melissa, without hesitation, stepped forward. "You don't get to decide who I am anymore," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I don't want your offer, and I don't need it. I don't belong to you or anyone else. Not now, not ever." Vincent's eyes softened with pride as he looked at her. This was the woman he had been waiting to see all along. The woman who stood tall, no longer bound by the shackles of her past. She wasn't just a victim of her circumstances anymore. She was her own person, choosing her future. Hartley's face reddened in fury, but there was nothing he could do. Whitlock turned to leave, clearly not accustomed to rejection, but he didn't push any further. As they walked away, James shot one last venomous look at his daughter, but it was a look of resignation now. He had lost control over her. The confession. As the days went on, Melissa began to feel more at ease in her new life. But there was still something deep within her that she couldn't shake. The weight of her past. The constant fear of being abandoned, of being someone's possession, still gnawed at her heart. She had been taught to survive, not to thrive. She had learned how to survive in silence, to endure the hardship without complaint. But here, with Vincent, she didn't have to hide anymore. Here she could be seen. But could she trust that? One evening, as they sat by the hearth in the main house, Vincent looked at her with an intensity she hadn't expected. He had seen her at her weakest, when she was broken and unsure, but now he saw her for the woman she was, strong, beautiful, and full of a quiet strength that moved him. "What's wrong, Melissa?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of the unspoken question. "I can see it in your eyes." "What's keeping you from letting go?" Melissa's eyes lowered as she took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change, when she would have to decide whether to fully let go of her past and step into the future Vincent was offering her. "I've been looking for a way out of my past for so long," she said, her voice trembling. "But I've never been able to let go of it. I've never been able to trust anyone. Not really. Not even myself." She paused, her eyes flickering to Vincent's, searching for something. "I'm scared, Vincent. Scared that if I trust, if I let go of all the hurt and the fear, I'll be hurt again." Vincent's eyes softened and he moved closer, his hand reaching out to gently cup her face. "You're safe here, Melissa. I don't just say that, I mean it. This isn't about obligation, it's about choice. You're not here because you have to be. You're here because you want to be. You're part of this family now, and no matter what happens, no matter what the past holds, you're safe here." The weight of his words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with an overwhelming force. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. The moment when she didn't have to hide anymore. The moment when she could finally choose her own path. "I choose to stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But in that moment, the truth was undeniable. She had chosen, and in doing so, she had reclaimed herself. A new beginning. The ranch had become more than just a place of refuge. It had become her home. The sun set behind the hills, casting long golden shadows across the land. Melissa, Vincent, and Ella stood together, a family by choice, not by blood. The life they had built wasn't perfect, but it was real. There were still struggles, still challenges ahead, but for the first time, Melissa felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. As they walked toward the horizon, Vincent's hand gently held hers. Ella skipped ahead, her small voice carrying on the breeze. "Are we going now?" she asked, her words full of hope. Melissa laughed softly, her heart full. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're going. We're going to make this our home." And as they walked together, the world around them seemed to fade away. The winds of the west would blow harshly, but they would face it together as a family, strong, united, and free.